In 1945, the war ended, Berlin fell, Germany was defeated, and the world moved into a new chapter. But history did not have to end that way. There were moments. During the Second World War, when the outcome was not certain, there were battles, decisions, mistakes, and turning points that could have changed everything. So the question is disturbing, but important. What if Germany had won World War II? This is not just a fantasy question. In the early years of the war, Germany had already taken control of large parts of Europe. France had fallen, Poland had been occupied, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and much of the Balkans had come under German control or influence. For a time, Germany looked like a power that would be very difficult to stop. So this question is not completely imaginary. It asks something much darker. If a few major battles had ended differently, if a few political decisions had changed, what kind of world might have followed? First, Germany winning the war would not have meant winning one single battle. It would have required several major events to go differently. Britain would have needed to make peace or become unable to continue the war. The Soviet Union would have needed to collapse in the East, and the United States would either have entered the war too late or failed to gain a decisive advantage in Europe. In other words, Germany would have needed to win the larger strategic picture, not just one front, not just one campaign, the whole balance of the war. If that had happened, the first major change would have appeared on the map of Europe. Many independent countries would have lost real control over their own future. Some would have remained under direct foreign rule. Others might have existed only in name, while being controlled from Berlin, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and many other countries could have lost much of their sovereignty. Parliaments would have been weakened or replaced. Political parties would have been banned or controlled. The press would no longer have been free. Elections, courts, and basic rights might still have existed on paper, but in reality, power would have belonged to an authoritarian system. Germany's goal was not only military victory. Its leaders wanted to reshape Europe. Their planned order was based on domination, strict hierarchy, racial ideology, and state control. For Eastern Europe, the consequences could have been even more severe. German plans for the East treated large areas as future zones for settlement, labor, and resource extraction. This means that people living in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and western parts of the Soviet Union could have faced mass pressure, forced removal, and long-term control under an extremely harsh system. Eastern Europe would not simply have been occupied. It could have been reshaped by force. If Germany had defeated the Soviet Union, it would have been one of the largest political turning points of the 20th century. Moscow might have fallen, or the Soviet government might have been pushed far to the east. Even if the Soviet Union had not disappeared completely, its influence in Europe would have been broken. The post-war world might not have been divided between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it could have been shaped by a German-dominated Europe on one side and the United States on the other. The Cold War we know today might have looked completely different. Perhaps Washington and Berlin would have faced each other for decades. Perhaps Europe would have remained closed, militarized, and authoritarian for a very long time. Perhaps the arms race would have started in an even darker form. Britain was another key point. If Britain had been forced to make peace in 1940 or 1941, one of Germany's biggest obstacles would have disappeared. That would have changed the Atlantic War. It would have made it much harder for the United States to return to Europe. An operation like D-Day might never have happened, or it might have happened too late. In that version of history, the liberation of Europe would have been far more difficult. The daily life of ordinary people would also have changed. The war might have ended, but peace would not have meant freedom. People could have lived under a system built on fear, surveillance, and obedience. Schools would have taught a rewritten version of history. Newspapers would have printed only what the state allowed. Radio and cinema would have become tools of propaganda. People would have watched what they said, what they read, who they trusted and who they spoke to. Fear would not have stayed. On the battlefield, it would have entered everyday life for Jewish communities and other groups targeted by Nazi ideology. The result would have been catastrophic. A German victory would not have stopped the policies of persecution. It could have made them stronger, longer, and harder to escape. So this scenario is not only about borders changing on a map, it is about the value of human life being placed under the control of a violent ideology. The rest of the world would have changed too. The United Nations might never have formed in the way it did. The path toward European cooperation, which later led to the European Union, might never have begun. Instead of rebuilding Europe through peace and partnership, the continent could have remained under the shadow of military power. The creation of Israel, the balance of power in the Middle East, the end of colonial empires and modern ideas of human rights could all have developed in very different ways. Even technology might have followed a darker path. During the war, Germany made advances in rockets, jet aircraft, and military technology. If Germany had won, these fields might have developed further, but progress in technology does not always mean progress in freedom. Those inventions could have been used to strengthen state control, expand military power, and build a more dangerous security system. Technology might have moved forward, but human freedom could have moved backward. Still, a German victory would not have created a stable paradise for its rulers. That kind of empire would have faced serious problems. Occupied nations would not have stayed silent forever. Resistance movements could have grown. Supply lines would have been stretched. Resources would have been difficult to manage. Internal power struggles could have weakened the system from within. So even if Germany had won the war, it does not mean it would have ruled peacefully forever. But one thing is likely. The world would have become more authoritarian, more militarized, and far more dangerous. That is what makes this question so unsettling. We often look at history as if the final result was guaranteed, as if the defeat of Germany in 1945 was always going to happen, but it was not guaranteed. A few battles, a few decisions, a few mistakes, and the world could have moved in a completely different direction. The Europe we know today might not exist. Democracy might not have returned to much of the continent. Free press, human rights, and international law might have become much weaker ideas. The second half of the 20th century might not have been an age of rebuilding. It might have been a long age of darkness. So the question, what if Germany had won, is not just an alternate history question. It is a warning. Wars are not only fought for land or borders or flags. Sometimes they decide what kind of future people will live in, whether they will have rights, whether they will have a voice, whether truth will survive, and whether freedom will have a place in the world. Germany lost the war, but if it had won, the world would not only have been different, it would have been darker.